Um, so today we're going to be talking about native plants and using them for pollinator habitat mainly. But when we say native plants, what are we actually talking about, right? We're actually normally give it a little time frame estimate. So we basically say it was the plants that were here pre-European settlement, right? So it was back when the Native Americans were here, and they kept a lot of this area open in Kentucky with the use of fire, right? So they would actually light these ring fires, which are just huge fires. A lot of them are like 5 miles wide. It's basically a fire that's in a circle. And when you burn a fire in a circle, right, it burns really hot and really fast. It would actually kill some of the animals for them to be able to have immediate food to eat on. But it also, after burning, a lot of fresh green growth would come here, and it would attract a lot of large herbivores over into the area for them to be able to hunt on. So especially here in Kentucky, we didn't have one single tribe that kind of settled it. This was more of a hunting ground. So several tribes would come over in here. So actually the Cherokee word for Kentucky meant dark and bloody ground. And the Wyandot Indians, their word for Kentucky actually meant grassland and cane land. Um, and we know a lot of this because of this guy right here, Andre Francois Michaud. He gave a lot of historical accounts and wrote about these areas back in the 1700s. And he especially talked about the Big Barrens region here. So the Big Barrens region, as you can see, if y'all can see my cursor there, it's that crescent shape you see of the tan/dark orange color. And he talked about an establishment, Bacon Creek establishment in there, which is roughly in this area. And he talked about how that area, there was a 70-mile wide stretch that's completely void of trees. It was all tall grass prairie back in the 1700s. And basically that's where 65 is running up now, up and down the state of Kentucky there. And so if you're driving up that interstate, you look through there now, you'll actually see how much of it now is reforested or in crop ground compared to being mostly tall grass prairie like it was in the 1700s. And so basically we can still find parts of these prairies that are scattered out and about. These are prairie remnants, and a remnant just means a small portion of something that's left. And these are scattered throughout the state. It's actually where we at Roundstone Native Seed can actually go and find some of our foundation collections that we go, and we can hand collect from those areas. We'll take those and bring them back and actually propagate them here on the home farm and be able to grow everything out in a monoculture so that we can make a custom mix specifically for certain goals. But natives, right, they're a lot different than everything that what a lot of people are used to. So if you're used to introduced plants, such as corn poppies or the fescues and the clovers and all these things, those have all been selectively bred to germinate quickly and to germinate all at one time. Natives are not that way. Natives have very long germination windows, right? So some natives can have 60 to 120 plus day germination windows, which means you can plant 2 seeds side by side and water them on the same day. One may germinate a few weeks from now, and another one may not germinate for another 120 days after that. So as you see here in this picture, this is partridge pea. Over here on the right, this one germinated quickly and grew up, where then this one was planted at the same time. It's just now sprouting months later. Now, what this is nature's insurance, right? So if something was to germinate and then the conditions turn off bad, we run into a drought, right? And that seedling ends up dying off due to that drought, it's okay because you have another seed right here that will take its place later on. And that's why that germination window is so much varied. And that's a lot better than the introduced species where we really have to worry about watering and making sure that we're keeping the conditions good throughout the entire growing cycle for those introduced species, because they have been bred to germinate all at one time. And since they do, they can all die off at one time. Another thing that makes natives a lot different is they're really, really slow to grow, right? So they spend most of their energy that first year developing a root system. And so they can put down 3 to 4 feet of roots within that first year. And so during that time, when they're spending that energy, they may only have a few inches of top growth and not much more than that, and everything else is going to the roots. And when that happens, all these introduced species that are putting all their energy into top growth can easily outcompete them. So that's going to make site prep absolutely crucial, especially for pollinator habitat, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Another thing that needs to be considered when dealing with natives versus the introduced plants, especially for pollinator habitats, is make sure when you're getting your seed that you're ordering it based on pure live seed, or PLS, some people will call it. And basically what that means is you're only paying for the viable amount of seed that's in there. So you're not paying for any inert matter or chaff or seed that's not viable for it to germinate. So fescue, when it comes in, right, it can be 90% pure live seed or 60% pure live seed. It doesn't matter. It's going to end up, you're still paying the same $1.50. Well, with natives, you may order 1 pound. This is a pure live seed version over here on the left. 1 pound of pure live seed, we may have to send you 1.25 or 1.5 pounds of bulk weight to get you 1 pound of pure live seed. Now this is a dramatization, obviously, photo of it, but you can see basically this PLS, pure live seed, came out of this right here, is the way that works. Another thing that makes natives a lot different, right, is they can tend to be fluffier mixes, especially if you have a lot of grass in them or a lot of short grass like little blue stem, split beard blue stem, or some of the wildflowers are also fluffy, and they have what's called on them these beards and awns. So if you see over here on the right, you can see some of these awns sticking out the end and these little white hairs on it. Those are called beards, right? And that makes it appear light and fluffy in there. Some species we can debeard and make it very slick and flowable, like you see on the left. It's an example of a debearded seed. But some of them we can't, right? So it's going to end up still being fluffy. We would end up damaging too much of the seed. So don't be surprised if when you get it, it appears to be, very light and fluffy seed compared to what you're used to, of like just a fescue bag or just an individual wildflower seed bag into it. This is a UK extension presentation, so we have to have a scientific chart and graph on there. I prefer the green line. But we also have our seed tested every 9 months. So with natives, you have to test it a lot more often. And so we have it tested every 9 months. And if they find one Johnson grass seed and a lot of seed, it puts a stop sale on the whole thing. That means you can't sell it, you can't give it away. It has to either be destroyed or it has to be completely recleaned and retested, which is a very expensive process. And another thing to keep in mind, especially when it comes to pollinator habitat, is what type of natives are you getting? So now that natives are becoming more and more popular, right, we're getting a lot more cultivars. But an original natural native is an ecotype, right? It has survived into the conditions, the natural conditions of a certain area. And this is switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. This is a Georgia ecotype, and this is its height at max maturity. This guy is about 6'2". And it's actually, this is a production field, so it's actually under irrigation as well. So it's like prime condition for it. And then you also have this, which is also Panicum virgatum. And this is another guy that's also, he's about 6'1", 6'2". And this is his hand right here that you see standing up. This one can get 10 to 12 foot tall, and it burns at a low grade coal. So it's really hot. It actually melts the paint off our trucks if they're too close when we burn these fields off every year. So making sure you know what you're getting, especially when you go to put these in a pollinator habitat, is incredibly crucial, because if you put this kind of cultivar of grass in there, it's going to choke everything out and smother it. You'd rather make sure that you have an ecotype that's used to it. Same thing goes with some of the wildflowers, right? You're starting to notice a lot more of the wildflowers coming in and having a cultivar, which is just, right, it's just a native, it can be a native plant that they have taken a specific trait and they have cultivated it for that trait, a certain color, certain height, or certain burn BTUs on it, like this one was. For instance, you're seeing a lot more purple cone flowers now be like gray-headed cone flowers and that kind of thing. So when you're getting ready to put these pollinator habitats in, the land use matters that you're going to be putting it in. So site prep is absolutely crucial. And the first thing you need to be looking at is, where are you putting it? Are you taking it from where it's originally forested? We have a lot more chance for a good native seed bank and less weedy competition there. So you may need fewer treatments there. Same thing kind of goes for a crop field. You can use fewer treatments because it ends up being that you know, don't have to have any. They've been doing the site prep and weed control for you, all the way out to where you have a pasture or fallow field that's full of weeds and is going to have a lot of problem weeds. And those weeds can easily outcompete the natives. So it may take 3 to 5 treatments on a site before you're ready to actually get in there and get it done if it's a pasture or a fallow field. And there's different site prep methods. There's an organic and there's non-organic methods, right? So for organic site prep, you're basically looking at these different options that you have here. Now, when it comes to organic methods, I will say this, it does take longer. You need to be doing site prep longer, and you also have a higher chance of stand failures, especially in areas that have invasive species. So we actually do not recommend, if you have an invasive species present on a site that you're trying to put this in, we do not recommend attempting to do it organically. Unfortunately, we just have to have those removed from the landscape prior to it. So invasive species are like a cancer, and a non-organic herbicide is the chemotherapy that is needed to remove those. But here we're going to look at some of these. With the first one, the organic herbicides, there's not much, I have not had much success with it. It's mostly top killing. You're not getting good root kills with them. I would like to be able to find some more that are better suited for it, but unfortunately at this time there's just not a whole lot. So we end up doing a lot more of these other site prep processes. So we'll go through and do what's called a repeat tillage method. And in this time we'll go through, right, and we do a deep tillage like you're used to, and you're getting down 4 to 6 inches deep. And you're exposing a whole bunch of weed seeds that come up in there. There's millions of seed in the seed bank. And every time you disc, right, you're going to expose new weed seeds. So when you're doing the repeat tillage method, it is crucial that on the first one, you can do the deep tillage. But then after that, you need to be doing a shallow till. So you're only trying to do 1 to no more than 2 inches of it with a tiller, that you're trying to just keep reducing that seed bank down. You're never going to eliminate it, but what you do is you do that deep tillage, then you allow for it to germinate and start getting some young seedling growth in there, and then you knock those back and just lightly hit that top of the soil. And for really, really small areas, you can do your shallow tillage with the garden hose and stuff like that, that you can just rake over the top of the ground and to be killing those out. Because if you continuously do deep tillages, you're never going to reduce that seed bank down. You just don't have a chance to do that in 4 to 6 inches of soil, whereas you can typically within 1 inch of soil. You also want to normally start this process in the winter. It helps mitigate some of the issues, because normally if you start it in the summertime, you can cause a lot more of the warm season weed issues like crabgrass and foxtails and those kind of things. Another site prep process is solarization. It's using plastic and using the rays of the sun that go through that plastic to actually heat that soil up. And heat is a killer to seed, right? So when using this method right here, you want to make sure that you have your plastic buried really good around the edges so that no wind can get up underneath it, as well as you want to make sure that you're having all of your objects in the middle be able to hold it down some to keep it from flapping as well. And you want this tight but not taut. Like, you don't want it so tight that there's no give to it whatsoever, because deer, you're gonna find that deer walk across it, or even your dogs can go across it and can poke holes in it. And when you poke holes in it, it allows heat to get out of that area, it allows moisture in it, so you can have growth in there. And that's why you need to regularly monitor and maintain this plastic in here. And it typically is going to take at least a good growing season. I typically like to do 3 to 6 weeks of laying the plastic down, maybe pull it off to see if there's going to be any problem weeds. Because what you'll notice here with this method is you may have some issues with rhizomatous species that have a hard time, or that are hard to kill and may continue to come back. By removing it off, allowing stuff to germinate again, and to seeing the response time of that germination may let you know that, okay, yeah, I need to put it back down to do another kill on it to try and get it even more before I put my natives down. Another option is smothering that some people do. So you can do smothering with either black plastic. Some people do the laying down straw, putting down thick mats of straw. Other ones use live cover crops, so they'll put a cover crop down in the fall, and then they'll crimp it down in the spring. Now, what this does is this helps reduce immediate amount of competition that you'll have. But what I've been noticing is that as time goes on, or if you have to do any kind of management, basically you're just suppressing the weeds and not really fully getting them rid of them. So I only recommend this in really small sites that you're going to be trying to do this in, because in larger sites you can run into some major issues later on. And it's also really important for these areas here that you make sure you know what rise, like if you're doing a cover crop, make sure you know what rise you're putting down. All right, so you don't want to use perennial ryegrass, you don't want to use annual ryegrass if you can prefer it. Now you can use cereal rye if you need to, because it's going to be the biomass producer, right? But when you're using this, you have to make sure that you are terminating these crops prior to establishment. And also, you don't want to use any of the clovers or anything like that, because those are now weeds that can now easily outcompete your native vegetation that you're trying to put down. But the most common, because unfortunately, the most common site prep method that we use is the non-organic method, herbicide. And that's just because, like I said earlier, we have so many introduced and invasive species on the landscape now. It's just become such an issue to have to get those removed. And the most effective means and the quickest way of doing that is by use of herbicides. So we have found that by sacrificing 1 year using those herbicides, we can use a whole lot less herbicides into the future. So that's one thing that we want to take into. But one of the main big focuses away from this talk today that you should get is, like, actually the number one thing is, the number one reason for stand failures is improper weed control. So time and time again, people think, oh, I want to go out there and I want to do, they think about it in May or they think about it in June, and they're like, I want to do pollinator habitat. They go and they kill the site off and then they plant their natives. This is not recommended at all, because that's going to lead to a high chance of stand failure and a high probability that you're just going to be covered up with a combination of weeds and maybe some pollinator species out there. So this is an example right here that you can see that is commonly happening. So a lot of these things, especially if you get into programs that do a little bit larger acreages, half acres or more, you'll be looking at people doing a lot of cool season weed control, but not a lot of warm season weed control. So ideally, I would like at least 2 shots at cool season weeds, which is your fescues, clovers, and that kind of thing. And I'd also like 2 shots at warm season weeds, which is your crabgrass, foxtails, Johnson grass, that kind of thing. And as you see here on the right, you have this whole field was done. The farmer didn't want to do a third herbicide application, so we convinced them to use it as a test plot. We did 2 herbicides on the left-hand side, and they were done in early spring, and then a third herbicide done in late spring, and then the natives were planted into here. So everything you see on the left is actually all just crabgrass and Johnson grass and foxtail coming in. And then everything on the right is all these little bitty things are just the native seedlings coming up and doing it. So everything on the left ended up being a stand failure, and everything on the right came through and turned into a very successful pollinator habitat. And so here's just some more examples that we're dealing with here. Commonly, you'll go out there, right, and you'll apply 1 herbicide application and you get a good solid kill, and everybody's like, yes, that's a good kill, I'm good. And they keep forgetting about that seed bank that has those millions of seeds in there. So especially a lot of times if it's an old fescue field or old lawn, once you remove that sod forming grass there, it's been suppressing stuff that you didn't even know was there. And so once you remove it, boom, that seed bank explodes. So this is an example after 1 herbicide application, and we got back a lot of common ragweed and Johnson grass. So that would end up being a stand failure right there, especially with that invasive species of the Johnson grass. Even got some thistles over here. Here's an example of after 2 herbicide applications, right? And again, this is pretty common. They got really good cool season weed control, but no warm season weed control. So they didn't allow for those warm season weeds to take place. And so this is all Johnson grass and foxtails coming back in here. And then here's an example of after 3 herbicides. So now you can start to see the response back from the seed bank is being reduced. It's slowing down. Now after 3, depending on your land use that you dealt with, you may notice, okay, this out here is Johnson grass and we need to spray it a 4th time and kill it off. Or it could end up being like native grass, like purple top, that you can then keep and decide to either put into your mix if it's not already in there because you know it's going to do well, or maybe you have enough of it so you can remove it from your mix and you don't have to pay for it then. But more importantly is when those species come up, it tells you what plant community would have lived there. And so that gives you a better idea of what plants to put in your mixes that will do well and thrive and be great for the pollinators. So these are the most common seeding methods that we have. You know, it's broadcasting, drilling, and hydroseeding. I don't think anybody in here will be hydroseeding. Today we're mainly going to be focusing on broadcasting because I think most of the people here are small scale. So we'll be doing in the back. If you have any questions about drilling, we can discuss that later. But with the broadcasting, you know, this can be done large scale or small scale. Over here on the right, this is a great one if you're going to do several of these. This is really nice to have, or a decent amount of acreage where you're doing, you know, 1/4 acre, 1/2 acre amount or more, maybe even 1 or 2, 3 acres. You can use this, and what it is down here is at the bottom. There's an agitation cone that you can actually remove, drill you a couple holes in, and put some zip ties on it. And then now those zip ties actually makes it an actual agitator. Goes down in here that'll turn and help keep that seed stirred up around the hole to keep it flowing out. Because some of the natives can be very hard to go through some of the broadcasters. So some of the bag type broadcasters that you're dealing with, you may end up having to stick your hands down in the bottom and keep your finger moving over the hole to keep the seed flowing through. Or you can also use some carriers, which we'll talk about here in a minute, that help with the flow as well. But when it comes to broadcasting, you need to make sure that you are actually measuring out the amount of seed. So if you have multiple fields, go ahead and measure out those seeds for that field to make sure that you're only going to put out that seed that's needed in that area. And this will help prevent you from going out and throwing all of your seed out into the one field when you have 4. Or if you only have 1, we definitely recommend still that you're making multiple passes, right? You don't ever want to try to broadcast in one pass. You want to make multiple passes with it. And that will also help make sure that you don't run out. So this is an example, right? If you were been doing that repeat tillage method and you'd gone through and you tilled it up and then you'd done several shallow tillages till you had slowed down the response from that seed bank, what we do is we go out and we make a footprint test. And when you go to make that footprint, if you make a footprint more than 1/4 inch deep, that means you're going to plant that seed too deep. So most natives need to be planted about 1/8 to 1/4 inch deep. You'd actually rather have this seed planted on top of the ground than planted too deep. So for instance, right here, did the footprint, it was more than 1/4 inch deep. So we took this roller and you roll the site, right? So you roll that site to get you a good firm seed bed to broadcast that seed onto. Like I mentioned, you can use a carrier, you can use pelletized lime or kitty litter. You know, for small scales, you want to start off as low as you can and just keep increasing it, the ratio until you get what your broadcaster will handle. So for instance, it could be like a 1-to-1 ratio of seed to kitty litter, or if you're doing large scale, it could be 200 pounds of pelletized lime per acre that you're trying to put out there. Just shows you right there. But don't throw the cat out with the kitty litter there. So as you are broadcasting, like I mentioned, you want to make sure you broadcast at least in 2 different directions. So the smaller the site is, the more I'll actually go over it. So if it's a T90 site, I'll go over that in every different direction that I possibly can. So for instance, if I'm doing it twice and I'm trying to put down 20 pounds per acre, I'll take 10 pounds per acre and go over the entire site, the length of the field. And then I'll take another 10 pounds per acre and I'll go over the entire site, the width of the field in the opposite direction. That way I can make sure that we are getting good, even coverage across the entire site. It also allows for you to, excuse me, it allows for you to adjust your rates if you need to make sure that you don't run out of seed, because you can find out that you're putting too much seed out. We have a lot of clients that can end up, if it's their first time ever broadcasting over an area, if they're trying to do 1,000 or 2,000 square feet, you don't actually need a whole lot of seed for that area, and they can run out of seed within 15, 20 feet. And so I would also recommend that if you've never done it before, to practice first. You can practice with oats or just the kitty litter without the seed in it first, broadcasting it out there till you get your pace down and your method down that you want to do there. But after you broadcast that seed, right, you should have a good, even seed coverage, right? You'd rather have, all the seed on top of the ground than too deep. And then after you broadcast the seed, you're going to roll and cultipack that area to make sure you get good seed to soil contact. And then this can be translated into, larger and small scale. This is just smaller scales. You can use rakes to get it out there, to smooth it out if you need to. You can tamp it down. You can actually buy this actual tamp here from like Tractor Supply, or you can use the back of a shovel. We've used 50 kindergartner kids, anything that you need to, depending on your size of your project, to get a good firm seed count. Then for even smaller areas, you can do it by hand if you need to, especially really small seeded species. One helpful hint that you can do here is you can mix in vermiculite or flour, just enough to give you some visualization. So as you're tossing it out there, you can see where you're actually putting that seed, making sure you're getting good seed to soil contact. Because some of the natives can be really, really small and hard to see. Right, you broadcast that seed out there, get a good even coverage, going over it at least 2 times, sometimes even 4 to 6 times, depending on the size, to get that good coverage. Then you're gonna tamp it down again to make sure you have good seed to soil contact. But now what do you do if you go out there to make that footprint, but you've been doing something like solarization, or you've been doing a no-till method right here, and it's hard, so you don't make a footprint at all. So then when you go and no footprint is made, what you do is you take a drag harrow or a hard rake if it's a really small one, and you're just trying to lightly rough up the ground to get you about 1/8 inch roughed up so that you can then broadcast that seed. Do not disc up that ground, remember. So that's a common mistake that's made. They go in and they disc up the ground, which exposes a whole bunch more weed seeds and undoes all the site prep that you've already done. If you know you already have like a major compaction issue, like a logging deck or a road that's being converted or something, and that nothing's going to grow on, you need to take care of that compaction on the front end before you begin your site prep process. So loosen up that soil beforehand, and then allow those weeds to germinate and do that site prep process with following up with the herbicides later on. But again, so right, we just drag this area. This is a homemade one. You can also get one from Tractor Supply that's designed for it. That's much better and get done with single passes. But we just lightly roughed it up, and then you broadcast that seed out there, and then you roll and cultipack that site to make sure you're getting good seed to soil contact. And then you're going to see here, we did that in late June. This is March to early April, I think. So a lot of winter annuals are still in there. Remember, natives are really, really slow to grow, so you have to be patient that first year. And then that late May to early June, you start to get some blooms in there. And then by late June, you normally have it coming on and blooming. Another option is that no-till drilling. For sake of time, we're going to skip over this one. If anybody has any questions, we can discuss those one-on-one there with that. That's a Kentucky bobwhite quail grown on natives right there. I don't know where he came from, but he showed up on our farm one day. And so one of the main things to be considering about with a true pollinator plot, not necessarily a wildflower plot, but a pollinator plot, right, is we're trying to get blooms throughout the entire growing season. So most research has shown that you need at least 8 wildflower species. That's why most programs are trying to get you to do 9, and they want you to do 3 that bloom in the spring, 3 that bloom in the summer, and 3 that bloom in the fall. And you can continue to increase the number of species of blooms that you have, and you'll continue to help those pollinators. Now, it's also needing to know that just because it's a pollinator mix doesn't mean that it is necessarily a showy mix, right? We have some native species that are incredibly great pollinators, plant species, but they're not very showy. Like a lot of the mountain mints, the pollinators just flock to it, but it's not as showy as something as like purple coneflower or the black-eyed Susans. So keep that in mind. Another thing that makes planting pollinator habitat different is you also want to make sure that you have grasses in there. I do recommend that you actually do put grasses in there. If you don't, you're getting out of pollinator habitat and you're actually getting more into like a wildflower garden or a just a wildflower only plot, which can be done, but it's decreasing the amount of habitat that is available for other species and also including pollinators, because some pollinators actually use the grasses as host plants. And a lot of times you'll find bumblebees and stuff overnighting on these grasses until the dew wears off in the morning, and then they come on out. But the main thing with the grasses is they are the erosion control, right? So their root system is really helping with the erosion. And then also the winter aesthetics, right? Wildflowers are absolutely pretty in the summertime, but come winter, they're just ugly brown twigs. So what happens most of the time is clients go in and mow that down. And so when you mow that down during the wintertime, that ends up lowering the quality of habitat for pollinators. They need overwintering sites as well. And one thing to keep in mind, I want to make sure everybody understands the expectations. So a lot of times when you tell people that you got pollinator habitat, you look at it and people thinks this is what pollinator habitat is. Well, this is an introduced wildflower plot of corn poppies that have just come out there that bloom all at one time and nice and even. So if you're expecting to get this 6 weeks after you plant these natives and you end up getting this, you're not very happy. But this is what actually good native pollinator habitat can look like 6 weeks after planting when you come in there. All these are little young native seedlings germinating and coming up. We put in indicator species that can help come up and show you what is going on and make sure that you know that the rest are coming. And so what's happening there, right, is they're spending all that energy developing that root system, like I said. So they'll put down 3 to 4 feet of roots that first year. So that's why that site prep is so crucial, to make sure you don't have all this other stuff coming up and out competing them. Now we know because of this, you may end up having to use things like cover crops or nurse crops. So cover crop is when you're just trying to put down an introduced annual to postpone the planting. Let's say you're doing a tillage in the fall, or you're starting your herbicide in the fall. Maybe it's on a slope and you need to control that erosion. So you would put down a cover crop of, for instance, winter wheat in there to hold that site over the winter, so that you can continue your herbicide process that next spring to get both cool and warm season weed control, and then plant into that next spring. You'd kill it off and continue your herbicides and then plant. Whereas a nurse crop is when you're using some of those same exact introduced annuals in there, but they're at much lower rates so that they don't shade out your natives. And there's also a limited number. So for instance, with nurse crops, most of the time we're using oats in the spring at 20 to 32 pounds to the acre. And in the late spring to early summer, we're using brown top millet, which you see in this picture right here. And what that does is that gives you some quick growth. You plant something, a couple weeks later, you're going to start to see some growth. That helps control erosion. That helps suppress some of the weedy annuals that may be trying to come in. And it'll also help it hold in some soil moisture. Now, one thing we cannot use is we cannot use winter wheat with this. So winter wheat does have an allelopathic property to it that can harm some of the natives. So we try to avoid that if we can. So right, this is just an example right here of the native seedlings without a nurse crop growing. And that's an example of with the nurse crop that's growing in there. And what's happening is underneath, you'll have all these rosettes. There's the black-eyed Susan, there's the Cytosphragma, two great indicator species that are growing and developing underneath a very light canopy of the nurse crop. This is just some examples here. We have planted, done our site prep the year before, planted into good dead thatch. The nurse crop comes up, does its thing. Then the natives start to poke through. A lot of the annuals and biennials are going to come first, right? And then the perennials start to come in. And then as you see right here, this is a good example of the wildflowers or that dark brown everywhere in that field. This is a young stand, so then all the grasses is starting to come in. So the grasses, native grasses, are especially true about that sleep the first year, creep the second year, and leap the third year. And those native grasses give you that nice tan, golden tan hue there. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you do have some weedy issues coming in that first season after you plant, you can keep it mowed. We recommend it, we call it top clipping. You try to stay up above the native seedlings, but you keep it clipped to make sure that the non-target species that are growing are not shading out the young native species. What you don't want to happen is you don't want to come back 3 to 6 months later and see 6 to 8 foot tall weeds growing in there that have smothered out most of your natives, and then you're going in and mowing it and laying a huge thatch layer over it that smother out the rest of the weeds. And one thing I'll try to end here is you just have to make sure that when you're going through and you hear about these pollinator plots and stuff, these are not no-mow sites or anything like that. You have to do some kind of maintenance. So natural part of succession is the annuals come in and the perennial species start to come in. The grass may get a little bit thicker, and some shrubs and tree species are trying to come in and take over. So everything in the eastern United States wants to revert back to a forest. So if you don't do anything, it's going to do one or two things. It's either going to revert back to a forest, or it's going to turn into a Dollar General, one of the two. But here's just some quick examples here that we have of some pollinator habitat. This one right here hosted 1,000. This is hosted 1,000 monarchs right there the year after we planted it. And we actually got our first tag recovered in Mexico from it here recently. Some more examples there.